Let me introduce Dr. Anna Gromberg, who's the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, who will introduce today's speaker. Thanks.
Welcome, everybody. I'm stepping back a little bit because I have by nature a very loud voice, okay? So I have the great honor of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Leah Rawls Atkins. And I'm first going to tell you a little bit about Leah that, some of you may know, which we find in her, bibliography, CV, and then I'll tell you a little bit what you might not know, okay? Not to worry. It's all cool. All right, what we do know about Leah, she was the very first director of our Center for the Arts and Humanities, which is part of the College of Liberal Arts. And she was also the very first person, male or female, to receive a Ph.D. from the history program here at Auburn University. Leah has devoted her whole life to teaching and publishing on Alabama history, and she has numerous publications, and I'm just going to name a very few here of her very impressive list, and I did this cheat thing. I cut this out of a book. Yeah. But actually, I copied the book first. So I copied that. It's not out of the book, so it's a little improved from what we did 20 years ago. So, all right, some of her publications are Alabama, The History of a Deep South State, 19th Century Club, The Romantic Ideal, Alabama's Plantation Eden, The Valley and the Hills, and Carolyn Marshall Draughon, who is the wife of Ralph Draughon. This beautiful library is, of course, named after him. And I want to extend a special welcome to Ralph Draughon Jr., the son of Carolyn Marshall, who is with us today and who actually kicked off the series a couple weeks ago, the first one for our 150th birthday. And I would also like to welcome our new First Lady, Nell Richardson, who is in the audience. Thank you very much for honoring us with your presence, and a great supporter of the arts and humanities. All right, Leah has also provided leadership for the Alabama Historical Association and the Alabama Association of Historians. And she has worked closely with the Alabama Department of Archives and History, and she represented Auburn on the Alabama Historical Commission. All right, what you might not know about her, and this was only a few years ago, that Leah actually was the first Alabama world champion water skier and the first woman to be inducted into the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame. Okay. By the way, Leah looks like she just came from a vacation where she was water skiing, but she is still working, and her big project right now is she is finishing the history of the Alabama Power Company. Right? So Leah also has a very nice house, a very perfect cabin, a fun cabin on Lake Martin. And when I moved to Alabama here in '93, I didn't know anything about Alabama. So some friends, new friends, Alabamians, took me out on the lake and said, "Oh, this is Leah Atkins. Leah Atkins, Leah Atkins, Leah Atkins. She's a water skier." I said, "What is wrong with these people?" So I'm like, yeah, that's nice, And so now I am out on the lake taking my friends from New York and Connecticut and Germany and say, "Oh, you should know about Leah Atkins. Leah Atkins is..." So I'm now one of the crazy people that are just crazy about you, Leah. And, so you're famous in Alabama, and with all the international friends that we are bringing in, you're going to be world famous before you know it. And also, for those of you who are interested in taking a camera to Lake Martin this summer, I'm challenging her to water ski behind my boat. So we will make that video available for you all. All right, our wonderful Center for the Arts and Humanities, which I'm very proud of. Leah was the first director. It's our great outreach arm into the community, prison arts, Center for the Book, Alabama Court Reading, all these wonderful programs coming out of there. And Leah started it in a wonderful spirit, like a palatorium, like a gathering for scholars in the community where we all unite and have wonderful times and intellectual exchange. And the person that is really carrying on in this tradition is Jay Lamar, who is also in the audience today. You're hiding? No? Okay, right there. She's our new director, and Jay actually said these beautiful words about you, Leah, that I'm going to quote now, which will be a perfect bridge to your talk, right? So here's what Jay has to say about you. Leah has written about women at Auburn, but no one more than she really exemplifies what women could achieve at a time when it was not easy for women to gain admittance to, much less compete academically or athletically. She never took no for an answer to anything. Dr. Atkins.
I really think after that introduction that I should say, it is so nice to see you, and then sort of move in that direction and go home. I'm very, very happy to be here because, is this okay? Okay, I'm very happy to, this is so high. Is that better? Okay, now I can see over it. Okay, I'm very happy to be here, and of course Auburn has always been a very, very special place in my heart. I have struggled mightily to try to decide what I was going to say, since most everything I knew I'd already written about in the book, but people assured me that you all hadn't read the book. But that's okay. I have found a few new things I can spice it up with, so I think we'll have some fun today. If not from the time that the East Alabama Male College was chartered in 1856, certainly from the time the college opened to students October the 1st, 1859, and absolutely from 1872, when it became the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Alabama, women played an important role in the lives of the all-male student body. In fact, the Methodists who founded the male college in 1859 feared just that. They were so concerned about possible commingling of boys and girls, should they be too close, that they established the Methodist Men's College in Auburn and the Methodist Women's College some 25 miles, a long train ride or an even longer buggy ride away in Tuskegee. The school was always called Auburn, despite its name changes, and the college went on to have two more. The Alabama Polytechnic Institute from 1899, although it was called that earlier, a few years before the legislature actually changed the name to Auburn University in 1960. The Auburn campus of compulsory uniforms and marching drills and roll calls at daylight and stern military discipline was a male-only macho world. The town of Auburn was filled with boarding houses that catered to male students, barber shops and clothing stores with stocks of uniforms and men's suits. Secret fraternities thrived, though outlawed by the college, and youthful pranks were the order of the day. The village of Auburn was a wonderful place to be a girl because there were so many suitors to choose from. If there is one thing Auburn men held in common, it was that they loved the ladies and shared an idealized view of Southern womanhood. Cadets kept their belles on a pedestal, with their courting following Victorian rules of propriety. These attitudes also determined the education provided for females by their parents, as well as the education the state did not provide for them. In the antebellum era, women were taught at home or educated in female seminaries where distinctive Southern womanhood, I'm not going to say quote unquote, but I've got lots of quotes in here. If you listen to my voice, you can pick them up, and I just want to stop because some of their language was so wonderful, I just wanted to use it. Distinctive Southern womanhood could be protected. Higher learning was thought to be too taxing for a woman, and it could be physically harmful, perhaps resulting in brain fever. One medical doctor of the era claimed that a female needed special times to rest, especially during her monthly periods when there was an enormous increase of nerve waste and poison was retained in her system and acted upon the gray matter of the brain frontal lobes. Thus, excessive studying would be very harmful to her health. Alabama educational reformer Julia Tutwiler advocated education for women and higher education for women through coeducation. Opponents argued that male students would be distracted by having females in the classroom, and since women were mentally inferior, they would lower the academic standards of the institution. Women on campus would destroy religious beliefs, promote promiscuous behavior, force a change in the honor system, and ruin male camaraderie. Coeds would encourage men to marry early, before they were established in their professions, and thus it would have a pernicious effect upon the man's career. Tutwiler challenged such arguments. She believed that the loveliest women and noblest men grew up in families as sisters and brothers, and the segregation of the sexes dated from days when monks and nuns were the only teachers. In the hard times of the 1880s, Alabama parents could ill afford to send their daughters north to school, where the laboratories and faculties of the women's colleges matched those of the state universities at Auburn and Tuscaloosa. Although Tutwiler focused her attention on the University of Alabama, it was the Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical College at Auburn that first allowed women to matriculate. A&M College President William Leroy Brune, and I might mention that the family says it's Brune, not Brown, but the hall that was named for him, that was Brune Hall, was always called by Auburn kids Brown Hall. So now that I have you thoroughly confused, President William Leroy Brune was no doubt aware of Tutwiler's crusade, which was changing the climate of opinion in the state, when in 1892 he requested that the Auburn Board of Trustees admit women to degree programs. A number of Auburn professors were already allowing town women to sit in on lectures, and this had not proved distracting to the cadets, so the faculty supported the president's stand. A group of determined Auburn girls, especially faculty daughters, and particularly Brune's own precocious daughter, Kate Conway Brune, were behind the faculty's resolve and Brune's support for coeducation. I might stop and just make an aside. I think there's a money reason here. I think basically the faculty and the president realized if they just kept the girls at Auburn, it would be a lot better. But there is really town support, faculty support, and the president just had to convince the trustees. On June the 13th, 1892, the Auburn trustees voted to open the doors of the college to young women who are qualified to pursue the studies of the junior class. And the following fall, Kate Brune and two Auburn friends took and passed examinations and began classes in the general course of study. The next year, after watching the successful experiment at Auburn, the University of Alabama admitted women. In 1894, Kate Brune, Willie Little, and K.T. received their Auburn diplomas with all honors and accepted Governor Thomas G. Jones's congratulations at the largest graduation ceremony ever held at Auburn to that time. During the early years of coeducation, women who attended Auburn were town girls or from Opelika or Lee County, and they lived at home or they boarded with relatives. Auburn had no special rules for co-ed since they lived at home, except that women were required to walk directly to class and following class dismissal to depart the campus immediately so cadets would not be distracted. Later, the university furnished a small room on the second floor of Sanford Hall, then called Old Main, as a rest and study area for co-eds where they could stay between classes. Female enrollment grew slowly, reaching a high of 19 in 1898. But those females who attended Auburn won academic honors with ease, often pushing aside males for the Scholastic Awards. In 1905, the boys published a tribute to Auburn co-eds in the Glomerata. Notice particularly the play on the double meaning of crib, a cheating paper or a baby bed. Our co-eds are a lively set to say their lessons glib, and good grade marks they always get, yet never use a crib. They never smoke a cigarette or do a thing that's sin, do not swear, never bet, unless they're sure to win. To me, that seems surpassing queer, and yet I must confess, I'd give an A to every deer if I were their profess. They love ice cream, and that's no joke, and chew gum on the sly, and every beau they have goes broke in the sweet by and by. Their winsome smiles, their charming ways, I never could resist. I would give them words of praise, though every word they missed. In after years, I'd like to know if they will be so glib, their independent gates to go, or will they need a crib? Auburn coeds answered this challenge with a poem of their own. Note the strong feminist tone, very surprising for Auburn women just after the turn of the century. Coeds we are, we will admit, with proper shame of face. By man's decree, we only fit a secondary place. Of course, we cannot play football or smoke vile cigarettes or speak in slang, lest they should call us blooming suffragettes. It matters not how well we learn where blundering bumpkins stall. They get the honors we earn by Blarney or by Gall. Of graceless form and mind in earth they falter on the way, and then at last by sudden spurt retrieve the wasted day. Daughters of Eve, we still maintain our ancient mother's fame. We let the men get all the gain while we take all the blame. But though we lack in force of brute through scorn in all our powers, in courtship or in fierce dispute, the last word's always ours. In 1916, when Sarah Evelyn Moore graduated, she was the only woman in her class, and it is that picture of Sarah that's on the front of the little book. She wrote the class poem about the fair city of Auburn with its sturdy oaks donning garments of green in the spring times, full of homes, churches, college boys, coeds, and professors, a center of study and learning. She noted the names of great men who spoke at the college and whose deeds were recorded on boulder and tablet. She wrote of the Southland with great history yet to be written, and she told a new tale of Auburn, one of adventure and progress. At the site of her dear Auburn College gathered each Auburn, the freshmen as green as the grass is, boys mostly, with just a few coeds, like blossoms among the deep verdure. With a feminist strike so clean, she wrote, it surely passed without any of the boys of 1916 noticing. She wrote that after 4 years, some of the leaves were missing, but never one of your blossoms. For almost 30 years, Auburn provided no dormitory for women students, and coeds who attended Auburn boarded in town as the boys did, although the homes in which girls lodged were more carefully selected and the boarding houses were never mixed by sex. There were no college rules for their behavior because they were considered grown young ladies who behaved themselves at home and elsewhere with dignity and discretion and needed no matron. However, they did live under the watchful eye of the mistress of the house. Mary Yarber boarded 10 girls at her home, Pebble Hill, fed them their meals, loaned them her car to drive to Opelika for Sunday afternoon picture shows, and had only 2 rules: be a lady and have all your coat hangers hooked in the same direction. In 1940, the quad dorms, which had been constructed as part of FDR's Public Works Administration, opened to women students, replacing Smith Hall. Dr. Rosalie Walston, who was director of women students and then dean of women, worked with the architects to perfect the plans and position the buildings on the site. She believed when the girls moved in the quad that it was entirely too beautiful to be the scene of panty raids that had regularly occurred at Smith Hall. At one of President Luther Duncan's administrative meetings, Walston made such a statement, and all the gentlemen laughed, saying she could not stop them because once the men gathered and the raid started, no one knew who started them. Later, a longtime faculty member told Dean Walston that was not true. Everyone knew the A Club was responsible for starting the panty raids. Dean Walston immediately summoned the president of the A Club and told him there were to be no more panty raids. He replied, "Oh, no, ma'am, it's not us, it's a freshman." You can't be in the A Club until as a freshman. Dean Walston answered that if he could not control the freshman athletes, then she would, saying, "We are not going to have panty raids." Dean Walston established a protocol for locking the dorms and training her staff on what to do in case a raid started. A few weeks later, there was a large bonfire on a dark night, and Walston decided that the night air seemed right for a panty raid. She made the rounds of the dorms, checking with her staff to see that they were all warned and ready. As the dean came around the corner of dorm 3, she described running into the biggest boy I've ever seen, and he was standing there holding a huge club. And I said, "Just what are you doing in the quadrangle at this time of night?" And he replied to me, "I came to help you. The A Club sent me up here to help you in the panty raid." There was no panty raid that night. One of the most interesting events I discovered when I researched the small book I wrote to celebrate the centennial of women's enrollment at Auburn involved an incident that occurred in the spring of 1942. I felt I really couldn't write about it because I didn't have all the sources, and so I only mentioned it in passing. Dean of Women, Rosa Lee Walston, had closed her oral history that she had done with Alan Jones on April 11, 1982, and sealed her personal papers, which she donated to the Auburn Library after her, Auburn Library, and she had sealed them until after her death. In 1991-92, when I was doing my research, Dr. Walston was still living at a nursing home in Birmingham, and although I called and talked to her, she did fill out some papers and gave me some information, she refused my request to open her tape interview of her papers. I read President Luther Duncan's correspondence in the newspapers, which covered fully the event, but I barely mentioned the affair in my book. Walston has since died, and her taped interviews and her papers are now open, and I spent a few hours last week listening to the tape and reading her papers. The tape is very interesting. It's a very valuable source on the social history of the college and the town, and I've recommended that the tapes be transcribed so they could be more easily accessible. What happened shines a light on gender attitudes in the 1940s, on attitudes about coeds, women, and female college administrators, attitudes common among men of the time, not only college administrators, but alumni and citizens. It illustrates the political pressures an Auburn president has to deal with and how a discipline action could become debated across the state. In the spring of 1942, the United States was at war, and Auburn's male students were leaving for military service. The new women's dorms on the quadrangle had opened, and President Duncan had moved from what we called Social Center, and is now Cater Hall, to the fine new colonial president's home on Mell Street. Dean Walston had supervised, with the help of the art and interior design departments, decorating and furnishing the double parlors of Social Center for teas and receptions, and so young ladies could meet and visit with boys there. A more organized Women's Student Government Association was in place. It was one much earlier, but it was strengthened and sort of reorganized. To quickly summarize what happened, things and money began disappearing from the dorms. One of the girls living in dorm 2 came to Dean Walston and told her that someone was taking money from her. The dean enlisted the help of the state toxicology department, which was on campus. A bill was treated with crystals of nitrate, at least that's what I understand from the tapes, and a female student was confirmed spending the treated bill. The affair is much more complicated and the evidence much more involved, but the end result was that upon the recommendation of the dean and the Women's Student Government Association, the student was expelled by President Duncan in March 1942, and she went home to North Alabama. Under college rules, she could apply for readmission in September. This was a tragic affair because the student was talented and popular and showed great potential. In the days ahead, these events became the most well-known and talked about secret on campus and in the town of Auburn. The student's father brought his attorney to visit with President Duncan in Auburn on March 28th, and they demanded to see the evidence. Letters of support from the student's high school principal, neighbors, the county extension service, the Farm Bureau began to pour into the president's office. Duncan tells his staff that this will ruin Auburn in North Alabama. On April the 1st, Governor Frank M. Dixon wrote President Duncan that Under no circumstances would I try to interfere in a case of this kind, but I am inclined to go a long way, as I know you are, to save the future of a young woman in her position." Duncan, a masterful politician, understood exactly what the governor meant. On April 19th, a Sunday, Duncan took the train to the girl's hometown, initiating a conference with her attorney. The Auburn AAUP group began its own investigation. A professor came to Dean Walston to review the evidence in detail, and the dean later learned he didn't come from the Auburn AAUP chapter, as he told her, but was sent by the president. Threats were made against the budget of the state toxicology department. The race for state agricultural commissioner somehow got mixed up in the affair. The Auburn Extension Service backed Duncan, and the Auburn Baptist Church began holding daily prayer meetings to support the student. Then rumors circulated that President Duncan was going to back down and allow the student to return in June so she could graduate in December. Dean Walston requested that President Duncan inform her first if he decided to do this. Shortly, an announcement was made and that the student would be allowed to return in June but would live off campus. Dean Walston immediately submitted her resignation. Her entire staff resigned, a staff that included 4 dorm heads, the hostess at Social Center, the official chaperone of the university, and Dean Walston's secretary, Mary McGee Green, whose husband was a professor in the vet school. The president of the Women's Student Government Association resigned. Newspapers relegated the war news to second page, and on the front page of the state papers, as in Columbus, Georgia, were printed headlines an inch tall: Auburn's Dean of Women and entire staff had resigned in a row with the president over an ethical issue. The intensity increased as letters from all over the state flooded the president's office. Women writers tended to support the dean, although a number of men did write to congratulate Dean Walston on her stand on principle. At first, the newspapers supported Dean Walston, who, as the Selma Times-Journal reported on the 30th, was a woman, quote, who prefers resigning from a top-notch position to lowering her standards of right and wrong, end of quote. The trustees supported Duncan. Trustee Charles S. Culver of Gadsden wrote Dean Walston a short, polite letter that the directing head of the institution has the determination of matters of this character. Culver then wrote President Duncan that, quote, your college is better off without those 9 women in it who had no human understanding nor Christianity. He characterized Walston as a cold, unsympathetic woman, a temperamental old maid who does not need to be dean of women. If she could not adjust her own life, how can she direct others in adjusting theirs? If you will get rid of several more, you will have a better school. The people of Auburn are back of you. Divisions ran deep and feelings were high. Women students marched en masse to President Duncan's house to protest his action. Duncan told them they looked so pretty, please come back sometime and he'd serve them ice cream. Male students held a mass meeting in the middle of the quad to support Duncan. Coeds returned fraternity pins to boys who supported the president, and at least one engagement ring was returned by a young lady who announced she could not marry a man who had no principles. The media was having a field day. President Duncan appointed Home Economics Dean Marion Spidle to Dean of Women. Former Dean Walston took a job in Washington, D.C., and then accepted a position at a Georgia college where she stayed until she retired in the 1960s. In 1946, Katherine Cater accepted the position of Dean of Women at Auburn. Her title was changed in 1976 to Dean of Student Life when gender issues became sensitive. And Dean Cater served until her death in 1980. Cater, like Walston, never married, and she became one of the most beloved administrators in Auburn history. And I might have to pause and say that that is indeed true, but she was much more beloved after you graduated than she was when you were a student. She really put the fear in us, but my favorite story about Dean Cater that you probably have heard is there's a really fine Auburn novelist, Ann River Siddons, who was in school about the same time I was, and after several years, 10 years or so after she graduated, she was here on a Saturday for a football game and was eating dinner over at Opelika, and Dean Cater walked in and she immediately took her drink and put it on the floor, and her husband looked at her and he says, Ann, you don't have to hide your drink from Dean Cater anymore. What I've written about Auburn women in the little book I wrote for the Centennial of Women at Auburn raises about as many questions as it answers, and a full-length book about Auburn women is long overdue, as is, I think, a history of Auburn University itself. I am still not sure how all of these early co-eds felt about crashing into a man's world. I'm confident they felt pressure to measure up, to prove they could make the good grades that many men said they were incapable of earning. They studied hard and they set standards of academic achievement females are still maintaining. Have you ever been to a Phi Kappa Phi initiation lately? The number of women in those initiation lines is amazing. Today, Auburn's women's grade point averages remain high as they were years ago when they first entered. Indeed, for every quarter in the last decade, women's grade point averages at Auburn have been higher than men's averages. When the Century opened, tuition for women was $12. Now 9 months of tuition cost an Auburn co-ed or her parents, if she's a resident of Auburn, something like $2,200. I'm not sure exactly, but I think that's about right. In 2005, women students represented almost 50% of the student body. Gone are those days when there were 6, 7, and 8 boys for every co-ed. When women were first admitted to Auburn, there were no females on the faculty. Today, there are 327 women out of a total faculty of 1,177, less than 1/3, and they are less likely to hold chairs or endowed professorships. I ended my essay on Auburn co-eds with these words, which Pat Barnes selected to read at the luncheon celebrating the centennial of coeducation in Auburn. The world and Auburn have changed in 100 years. The experiment farms are far outside of town and across the state, not just on the South Campus behind Comer Hall. 2 former co-eds have flown in space, and Auburn women are doctors, nurses, scholars, teachers, engineers, architects, and bankers. Auburn women design clothes, create works of art, and treat sick animals. Auburn women are county agents, lab technicians, and accountants. They operate computers, compounds, and co-ops. They disperse drugs in hospitals and plan menus for schools. But despite all the years and all the changes, some things have remained the same. The co-eds of 1892 would recognize the outside of Sanford Hall, if not the inside, and they could still order a freshly squeezed lemonade at the soda fountain at Toomer's Corner. They would remember the names on buildings as people they knew, and they would find their names there too. If they wandered into a classroom, the desk would be strange, but professors who inspired and challenged students would not be unlike those who taught them. The women of 1892 would understand Auburn's struggle to provide quality education without adequate financial resources from the state, and they would feel right at home at a Golden Eagles reunion. The cheers might have been with different words and the songs with different tunes, but the love and commitment, the Auburn spirit, they would surely recognize. Thank you.
You've spoken about women students and administrators. I'm curious about women faculty. Does history record, excluding the Dean of Women and the Dean of Home Economics, who the first woman teaching faculty member was who was granted tenure, or the first one who came up and was promoted through the ranks to full professor?
I don't know that in my head. I'm sure you could find it out. I do know that the women begin to move into academic. That women begin to move into academic fields more during the war years when the men left, and many of them were faculty wives who had married their husbands, met their husbands in graduate school in Eastern and Midwestern universities, and so they began, to teach on sort of a temporary kind of basis. Many of them, of course, stayed around for a long, long time after that and taught the rest of their lives. But then after the war was over, with the GI Bill, there was such an explosion of enrollment that they were desperately needed, and so that was really the beginning of it. Most of these women did not have terminal degrees, and I don't know, but I think that certainly someone needs to research the the women faculty.
This is an open question. If Dr. Ward or Dr. Hudson could add anything, or anyone else in the audience, that might be interesting.
Bebel might know.
I really don't know. I know the English department had 2 women when I came in. They both had master's degrees.
Yeah. Well, were you the first woman to come to the English department? Did you have a Ph.D. from Chicago then?
No, I didn't when I first came.
Okay.
I still work.
Who was the first Ph.D. in the English department? Female?
Well, it should have been.
You? I think so. Probably so. But I think those are some kind of things that need to be explored and need to be researched.
Could you elaborate a little bit on some of the rules that Dean Cater had for the behavior of female students and the degree to which the university operated in loco parentis and did so differently for female than male students?
You know, there's a contrast because, you know, I said twice in here that the early females had no rules and regulations. They were expected to be ladies and to, you know, behave themselves. And so the rules began really under Walston a little bit toward the end, and then as you got the girls away from the boarding houses and more into a dorm situation, rules were a little more necessary, even in society. When you move into a city off the farm, you know, you got certain things. So I think that all of those students together were one of the reasons why they did. What were the rules that Dean Cater had? Well, you know, the most famous one is, of course, the raincoat thing. You could not wear your gym suit on campus. You had to wear a raincoat over it. So the most important thing you had to pick out as you came to Auburn as a freshman was a pretty raincoat. In fact, 2, the old one you had at home and then the new one your mother purchased for you. And raincoats were also necessary because, gee, it rained down here so much. I mean, you know, and you just tromp through everything, you know, in the rain. So that was one. We had 7:30, I think, at night. If you made good grades on Thursday nights, you got, after the first quarter, you got 9:15 on Thursday nights. And then you had 11 o'clock, as I recall, on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights. And I can remember the worst time is trying to leave Birmingham coming down 280, and we would round the corner there where the Three Pigs barbecue place was, and all of us knew how long it took to get from Dadeville and the Three Pigs to Dorm 9, you know, and we just wondered whether we would go end up with slow traffic and you couldn't get around, and then you're going to have a hard time getting in the dorm. You had to go up and talk to Dean Cater and get I guess I could give a personal story of Dean Cater. Before I came to Auburn in September of 1953, when I was a freshman, I won the World Tournament in Toronto, Canada. And so about 3 or 4 weeks later, the Alabama Theater ran the newsreel of that. And it was on 35 millimeter film, and nobody had 35 millimeter film but motion pictures. But Mom and Dad knew the guy who ran the Alabama Theater. So when they finished running it, he gave it to them. And Mama came down here with this little gizmo contraction that you did like this and you could see it. Well, the trouble is we couldn't figure any place to see it. And my boyfriend, who I eventually married, George, was living over in Graves Center. He was a football player. So we decided that if Mama and I could go in that little house and see that thing, I could see it, and then Mama could go back home again. But I couldn't go in the house with my mother with me because it was against the rules unless Dean Cater gave me written permission that I could do it. So I had to go to Dean Cater to ask her if I could go in there and see this on the wall with my mother there and all of this, and she really agonized on whether to give me permission to do that. But she finally said I could and wrote me a little permission, and off I went with Mother and George to see the 35 millimeter thing, which turned out to be so terribly small I couldn't even tell who anybody was. So, thank you so much.